Hello and welcome to today's lecture on the creation of the Third Reich, or Nazi Germany, for European history. In order to understand why Nazi Germany happened, or why the Third Reich happened, we have to go back to the problems of the government that preceded Nazi Germany, the so-called Weimar Republic. And remember that Weimar Republic is the first democratic German government that we had, and it was created at the end of World War I in a really kind of mild revolution. The very first thing, unfortunately, that this new democratic republic had to do was sign the Treaty of Versailles, which of course for the Germans was a very humiliating peace treaty in which they lost territory and wealth and the ability to have a military. They were on a pre-World War I trajectory of trying to find their so-called place in the sun, and of course this is the opposite of that, a terrible defeat in World War I. It was also problematic for the Weimar Republic that the very people who called this new democratic republic into existence seemed to have some sort of connection to what the Germans called the stab in the back myth. The idea that the soldiers in World War I were stabbed in the back not by home enemies, by people in the home front, such as communists or socialists and Jews. The working class did not support the war effort according to the stab in the back myth, and this is how the Germans lost World War I. Of course, you and I know that that's complete nonsense, that the German army simply stopped fighting in 1918. They just couldn't go on anymore. At the very onset of the Weimar Republic, there were threats from the left, the Spartacist revolt that you might remember happening in Berlin, or the Bavarian Soviet Republic that was established in Bavaria or in Munich and the region around Munich. There was also the right-wing threat, the far right-wing threat of the Kapp Putsch and the Beer Hall Putsch, which were done by Nazis or people who are like Nazis, let's say, extreme nationalists. There was also the 1923 hyperinflation that occurred. This is something that was happening, if you might remember, because the Germans were experimenting with not paying back the reparations that were demanded from the Treaty of Versailles, and the French would not tolerate that and occupied the Ruhr Valley, leading the German government to tell the workers in the Ruhr to not work, and paying for them to not work by simply printing money. Hyperinflation, of course, ruins the middle class, or ruins people who had some sort of savings, and really makes the middle classes turn against the Weimar Republic. And then, of course, everyone really is quite dissatisfied with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. Germany, as an industrial country, experienced a great deal of unemployment, almost 30%, with 6 million unemployed people at that point in time. All of these things taken together, are chipping away at the foundations of the Weimar Republic, and I would say the Great Depression really dooms it. Enter the main character here for Nazi Germany, who is an Austrian guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. Hitler I call an Austrian loser because growing up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and having dreams of being an artist, moving to Vienna, where he failed twice to get into the art academy there and kind of lived on the streets as a bum for a bit of time. When he's about to be drafted in the Austro-Hungarian army, he fled to Bavaria, to Germany next door, and was there when World War I broke out. He joins a German or Bavarian regiment in the German army and spends 4 years at the front, not as a soldier, but as a kind of a messenger running between between trenches and so on. Apparently does a decent job as a soldier, really enjoys something for the first time in his life, which is kind of crazy. He's one of the very few people who enjoyed World War I, and really never was promoted beyond the rank of corporal. That's just one rank above the regular soldier or regular rank of private. And the explanation for why he was never promoted was that he had no leadership potential. So that's kind of an interesting aside. At the end of the war, he is gassed, and he doesn't see the collapse of the German army. Therefore, he believes the stab in the back myth that I just talked about in the previous slide. He really doesn't have anything to do with himself after the war. The government hires him to go and watch politically radical groups, and instead of watching them and spying on them, he actually joins this group called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei in German. When he joins this group, he likes this group quite a bit. It's mostly for lower middle class people who are really quite dissatisfied with their lives after World War I. And he becomes a speaker for this group and finds that he's really quite good at that. When he gives speeches, oftentimes in beer halls in Munich, he is complaining about or railing against the Treaty of Versailles. He's railing or complaining about the new democratic system. He is quite fearful of communism and criticizes communism. You might remember that this is not too far long after the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Russia. And then another one of his favorite topics is Jews and how Jews are an evil influence on the entire world. He got this idea about Jews from the sort of racist nationalist ideology that was going around in Austria-Hungary around the time that he was living in Vienna. You might remember that Karl Lueger was mayor of Vienna at that point in time and got elected on an anti-Semitic platform. So he really feels that German people, out of all of the people of Austria-Hungary, of course the Austrians, were the best of the different ethnic groups in Austria-Hungary, and he really felt that Austria-Hungary was a terrible state, would much rather have belonged to Germany, and this is why he moved there shortly before World War I. He envisions a state based on ethnicity. They don't know about genes at this point in time, and so he wants a state to be based on blood ties. So it's a kind of very strange racist and nationalist kind of thing. And he uses some of the language that was invented in the 19th century about so-called Aryan people. These are, for the most part, Europeans, but oftentimes looked at as blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, as being the so-called master race, the best of all possible people. We saw that in the 19th century with other thinkers, and so it really shouldn't be a surprise that Hitler has this idea as well. Here he is. Doesn't have blonde hair. He does have sort of a creepy blue eyes, and there he is also giving a speech, one of the talents that he had. Well, if you remember the beer hall putsch, he encouraged a group of Germans to try to seize power from the Munich town government and start a revolution in Germany in 1923. This failed attempt led him to being sent to prison, and a very light sentence of 4 years, and then was out after about 9 months. During those 9 months, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, and in it he laid out his goals. It's kind of a shame that more people didn't read this book, because they could have figured out what Hitler was all about and maybe tried to stop him. But it's a terribly written book, and so it's really just hard to kind of get through. I'm not even talking about the ideas themselves, which are bad enough, but just the way it's written. Here are some of his goals as laid out in Mein Kampf. He, of course, wanted to do undo the Treaty of Versailles, get Germany to have a military again and stop paying the reparations. He wanted to rearm Germany. Of course, that would be in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, create another powerful military like they had before World War I or during World War I. He also had the idea, and this maybe comes at the end of World War I, that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, to expand the borders of Germany eastward. He wants to take over Central Europe, wants to get into Ukraine and other parts of what is the Soviet Union. And his idea is to capture or grab Lebensraum, or living space, for those Aryan people that he thought were the master race. You might remember in World War I, the Germans were really quite quite hungry, and he feels like getting these Aryan people to become the farmers of Central Europe, and in taking over this territory, of course, they are going to, in a kind of survival of the fittest way, enslave and then destroy the people who live there. The people who live there, of course, are Slavic people, or even quite a number of Jewish people. He wants to create what he calls a 1,000-year Reich, and as part of that also wants to solve the so-called Jewish problem, which is basically the existence of Jewish people who, once again, he feels are a really evil influence on the world. Now, all of these goals seem really kind of insane in the 1920s, and the Nazis are very much a fringe or radical right-wing group, very insignificant until the Great Depression, when the desperation of the Great Depression makes people start to pay attention and listen to him. The Great Depression itself really starts to destroy Weimar Germany. The Center and Social Democratic Party coalition that had more or less been running the Weimar Republic up to that point in time dissolved over how to react to the Great Depression. Many states had a hard time figuring out what to do with the Great Depression. And the president at that point in time was World War I Field Marshal hero Paul Hindenburg, and he starts to simply appoint chancellors to rule by emergency decree starting in 1930. It doesn't really help Weimar Germany that the reparations payments ended in around that period of time as well, and the Great Depression, of course, does really affect Germany in a very significant way. German unemployment moves in 1930 from 2.2 million people all the way up to 6 million people in 1932. As I said, it's about a third or so of the workforce. It's a very damaging time economically. You can see that the number of Nazis in the Reichstag increased dramatically. Before the Great Depression, it was 12 seats. In 1930, it was 107 seats. And in 1932, 230 seats. I believe that's about a third of the number of members of the Reichstag. Imagine, if you will, a third or more of the seats being filled by uniformed, kind of thuggish guys who have really no respect for the democratic process that they are a part of. The number of Nazis in the Reichstag in 1932 really shows how German people supported the right wing, how they feared the left wing, how they really feared the communists. I think there's probably about a 15% or so maximum support for actual communism and the Communist Party of Germany at that point in time. The large number of unemployed people due to the Great Depression swells political armies that all of the different political groupings have, and the Nazis have this group of thugs called the Brown Shirts, or the Sturmabteilung, the SA, and they are fighting in the streets with the communist Rote Front Battalion, or the Red Front battalions. There is a real fear among a lot of Germans, especially nice middle-class people, of a left-right civil war. People didn't particularly like the far-right ideas of Hitler, and they certainly feared the far-left ideas of communism. But they were really quite frightened by all of the violence that was occurring at this point. Here's an image of brown shirts in action, kind of marching through the streets. As I say, they're kind of like thugs. They are, I guess, the successors to, if you want to think about it, the Free Corps, who after World War I were battling in the streets with left-leaning people in those various kinds of attempted overthrows of the government, like the Spartacist Revolt and the Bavarian Soviet. You can see also that the number of SA men increased dramatically from 1930, about 100,000 uniform members to, in 1933, really 1 million men who are not military, they're not the police, they are just sort of uniformed thugs who listen to Hitler or listen to Hitler's chief of the Brown Shirts, a guy by the name of Ernst Röhm. 1 million men in uniform, which is much larger, of course, at that point in time than the actual German military, which was supposed to be about 100,000 soldiers. Well, the elites of Germany thought that they could use Hitler in order to burden him with responsibility. If they gave him power, they thought he would have to moderate some of his more extreme rhetoric. And President Hindenburg is convinced that he should do so. And so President Hindenburg appoints Hitler chancellor in January of 1933. Once again, he's not elected chancellor in a usual sort of parliamentary way, but appointed in a kind of emergency way. What, sadly, the old elites don't understand is that Hitler and the Nazis are not in support of a parliamentary democratic system, and that they intend to have a kind of Nazi revolution, which occurs really quite quickly after Hitler was appointed. This is a wonderful image of Hitler and Paul von Hindenburg, the decorated field marshal from World War I. I think this really shows us that the old elites, the kind of spiked helmeted warriors of the German past, are the old Prussian aristocracy are the guys who used to control Germany, and now we have this. At this point in time, a guy who appears to be exactly what he is, kind of a lower middle class uneducated guy from Austria who is taking power and is really quite subservient to the old aristocrat Hindenburg. This is all, of course, going to change really quite quickly. About a month after Hitler was appointed, there is a fire at the Reichstag, or the Parliament building, and a Dutch communist was blamed for starting this fire. Historians are really kind of unsure whether this young man did start the fire or not. It's kind of a bit of a debate, because this really does allow the Nazis to seize power. They blame this Reichstag arson, of course, on this young man and try him and execute him. But this also gives the pretext for the seizure of power that occurs right away. The Nazis claim that the Reichstag fire is the first step in a communist revolution. And so in March of 1933, they assemble the parliamentarians of the Reichstag and more or less intimidate them into passing an enabling act. The communists, of course, were not invited to vote on this because they are viewed as potential revolutionaries. And this enabling act repealed all of the freedoms that you would expect in a kind of democratic bourgeois system. The opponents of the Nazis were jailed right away, and concentration camps, the first concentration camps, are set up as early as this point in time. And they are concentrating the opponents or the enemies of the Nazis. And they aren't just holding people, they are, as you might imagine, terribly brutal places of confinement and torture and so on. And not death camps, we'll talk about that eventually, but really just a place where sometimes people died, sometimes people are brutalized to death or are murdered, and there is no protection of life, liberty, and property at this point in time. There was around this point in time, too, an election already scheduled, and it takes place, and the Nazis received 44% of the vote. This shows you that the Nazis are not, popular with the majority of Germans, but they are receiving support from all kinds of Germans, from all different social classes and all different kinds of occupations, and men and women, and so on and so forth. Beyond repealing all of the freedoms and starting to arrest the opponents of the Nazis very quickly moved towards coordination of society. In other words, Nazifying everything. They take the labor unions, which were independent organized labor, and Nazify them into a national labor front. This prevents those labor unions from opposing Hitler or opposing the Nazis. All of the non-Nazi political parties were outlawed. The state governments, which continued to exist up to that point in time, going all the way back to, small countries before German unification, were replaced by a new Nazi region called a Gau. And every one of those Nazi regions, every Gau was given a Gauleiter, or a leader of the Gau. And this is kind of like what the French did during the French Revolution, with creating a completely new kind of political unit. They're called départements during the French Revolution, but just to get rid of the old traditional territories and come up with something completely new. All organizations were either Nazified or forbidden. Germans like joining organizations, and you can imagine that even hiking clubs and teacher groups and card playing groups and whatever else the Germans were doing to be organized, that they had to become the National Socialist Hiking Club or the National Socialist Teachers Group. And like I said, if they weren't, they couldn't exist. Young people, as I've noted before, are really quite important for totalitarian states, and young boys were enrolled in something called the Hitler Youth, and the girls were enrolled in something which had a much less exciting name called the Organization of German Girls. Young people not having any kind of preconceived notions about what society should be like, and able to be educated in whatever way that the government or the educators want, are very important. And so young people are very important to Nazism. Here's some images of the Hitler Youth, young boys dressed just like the brown shirts or dressed like pre-military or paramilitary organizations. Here's also a creepy poster. It says, "A youth serves the leader." That's the creepy leader behind that young Aryan boy. And then at the bottom it says, "All 10-year-olds into the Hitler Youth." So Hitler wanted these young people to be, as he said in a speech one time, swift as a greyhound, tough as leather, and as hard as Krupp steel. Here are a couple of images of the Bund Deutsche Mädel, or the Organization of German Girls. You can see on the right, they are doing what Turnvater Jan would have liked, which is gymnastics in order to stay fit. The young girls are taught how to stay healthy and basically be breeders. The young boys and the Hitler Youth are doing a lot of Boy Scout type activities, but really with a kind of much more violent and paramilitary purpose. Well, the summer of 1934 is a period of time in which the Nazis consolidate power even more so. There was a bit of a problem with the gentleman you see on the lower right-hand side of the page. This is Anstrom. He is the leader of the brown shirts, and it was thought that he might want to seize power away from Hitler, or at least that he had the potential to do so since he had 1 million men under his control. And so in a couple of nights, the so-called Night of the Long Knives, Ernst Röhm and much of the leadership of the brown shirts, the SA, was taken into custody and murdered. A whole bunch of opponents of the Nazis were murdered in a couple of nights. President Hindenburg, who is at this point in time dying, was convinced that this was the Nazis' way of dealing with a potential revolution against the Nazis, and he kind of congratulated Hitler and then died shortly thereafter. Hitler then takes the title of Führer, or leader, and kind of molds together the positions of president and chancellor and becomes the undisputed dictator of Nazi Germany. The Nazi ideology is a kind of revolutionary romanticism. It's not based on reason. It's based on feeling. It is quite grotesque. It is very medieval in many respects, and so this is why I call it revolutionary romanticism. Of course, it is also Darwinian, with the idea of different races struggling for survival and survival of the fittest. Anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism or anti-communism are two main pillars of the Nazi ideology, and the Nazis link together Judaism and communism, believing that communism is created or was created by the Jews in order to further control the world in some sort of irrational way. There is also, like in other totalitarian states, a kind of Führer cult or leader cult, and that is in some ways stolen from Mussolini, but then amplified by the Nazis to the point where even a daily greeting is Heil Hitler or Hail Hitler, and Hitler is viewed as a genius. He's viewed by children as a figure who's more important than mother and father, and it's really pretty frightening. Hitler's a very strange individual, and so to turn him into a kind of god is kind of ridiculous. In terms of the Nazi ideology as well, women were supposed to be in the second sphere. It's kind of like that organization of German girls that I was telling you about. Women are supposed to be breeders of children and mothers and just really not work. They're supposed to stay at home and just create as many good Aryans as possible. In terms of religion, Christianity has to be tolerated in a Christian country. Nazism isn't like communism, saying that Christianity is the opiate of the masses. However, good Nazis really rejected the tenets of Christianity, especially all the stuff about love, loving your neighbor, and so on. Nazism for fanatical Nazis was much better than Christianity, and so to not believe in God, to kind of get into almost a Friedrich Nietzsche kind of God is dead, and the Übermensch or the Superman is creating his own morality is really what the Nazi ideology is all about. As I said before, there's this sort of a twisted Darwinism that exists in the Nazi state. A kind of racial science is if not invented, certainly made much more available and made much more popular at this point in time, dividing people into racial types and classes in a pseudoscientific way, and then going after people who the Nazis felt shouldn't be breeding or shouldn't have children. There was a large number of forced sterilizations starting in 1934 and lasting all the way through 1945. It's estimated that somewhere between 300 and 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized in order to not allow them to have children for whatever reason, be it the thought that they were career criminals or had mental illness or whatever it happened to be. There was lots of reasons for the Nazis to sterilize people. Starting with the outbreak of the war in September of 1939, it was decided that there were a number of mouths that were being fed in Germany that really didn't need to be fed, that people who were not contributing to Nazi society, people who weren't living lives worth living, should be done away with. And so the T4 program was begun to gas and to starve and to poison about 100,000 people who, for the most part, were in various kinds of state institutions for developmentally disabled people or for people who had mental illness. Really a terrible beginning of the genocidal crimes of the Nazis in 1939. Like I said, anti-Semitism, of course, was also a pillar of Nazism. Going to be more about that later. And then, of course, that plan for Lebensraum, or living space in Eastern Europe, is all part of this twisted Darwinism of survival of the fittest, and the Nazis taking what they wanted and showing that they were most fit and able to conquer others. The Nazi state is very much a police state. In 1933, between 30,000 and 40,000 brown shirts, and then also Hitler's bodyguard, the so-called SS, were made auxiliary police and were given police powers to help the Nazis into power and then to coordinate society. That Hitler's bodyguard, the SS or Schutzstaffel, went from a very small number of a kind of elite bodyguard to eventually being a kind of state within a state, with hundreds of thousands of people who were in the black uniforms of the SS, controlling the concentration camps and the death camps, actually being part of the army as well, or a kind of side army with SS units, and really controlling a lot of the economy with slave labor. The leader of the SS was a guy by the name of Heinrich Himmler, and he not only had control of the SS, he also was the person who at one point in time was running the Gestapo, or the Geheime Staatspolizei, or the secret state police. The SS and the Gestapo are above the law. Laws don't really matter anymore. Really, whatever the Nazis want to do, if they want to kill people, if they want to torture people or what have you, that's really what they're going to do. Here's some of the scary SS troops on the left. in their shiny black uniforms, and then there is Heinrich Himmler and what I consider to be his AP Euro trading card. Well, with the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, there is a ramping up of anti-Semitism, of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and there is over time a kind of decreasing ability for Jewish people to be part of normal German life. They start with going after Jewish people's ability to work, first with a boycott of all of the Jewish shops and businesses, then a forbidding of Jews from owning land, and then a forbidding of Jews from engaging in the kinds of professions that they got to engage in starting in the 19th century with the change in laws due to the Enlightenment. Over time, as we get closer to the war or during the war, there's an increased separation of Jewish people from civil society. They couldn't be in the military. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't live wherever they wanted to live. They had to live in special housing. There were curfews that were instituted. Radios were forbidden for Jewish people. And then also eventually having to designate themselves as Jews with yellow stars sewn onto every item of clothing that they owned. And then finally, deportation to the east once the war had gotten the Germans some territory in the east. Even before all of that happened, in 1935, there were the Nuremberg laws, which were passed, which defined Jewishness as a kind of racial category and explained exactly who was Jewish and to what extent. And the more Jewish one could say, then the less able one was able to function normally in German society. Jews at this point in time were no longer citizens of Germany. They now became subjects. It's kind of like a return to medieval times. And there was a great deal of fear of race mixing between Jewish people and non-Jewish people. And once again, I want to emphasize that this isn't really a religious thing. It doesn't really matter whether you, as a Jewish person, were practicing Jew or not. It really had to do with, according to the chart there, basically your grandparents and to what extent your grandparents were Jewish people, racially speaking. November 1938, there is the so-called Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, which was supposedly a spontaneous destruction of Jewish property and the abuse of Jewish people. It was really organized by the Nazis in order to put pressure upon the Jews to immigrate from Germany and to leave their property and wealth behind. 30,000 or so Jewish men and boys were arrested and sent to concentration camps until they were more or less ransomed by their families. This is a way for the Nazis, of course, to get wealth from Jews and to frighten them. There were a number of synagogues and shops and department stores and buildings that were all ransacked or burned, and the insurance money that was slated to pay for all of the damage that had occurred was confiscated by the German government, about a billion marks of insurance money confiscated as a fine against the Jews because the Jews were being blamed for the very violence that was being perpetrated against them. Kind of looks like this. Broken glass, of course, is the glass, or the crystal is the glass from shop windows. The Nazi economic policy was really kind of miraculous. It is kind of like a Keynesian economic policy on steroids. There's this amazing recovery from the Great Depression with massive public works projects and massive spending on the military, of course, all in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. But it gets people back to work. It gets men back to work, really, for the most part. And the unemployment problem is solved within a very short period of time. In 1936, a 4-year plan was created to prepare for war. This is not a kind of 4 or 5-year plan that you find in communism. It is a continuation of capitalism, but with great injections of capital by the state, instituting quite a bit of control over the industries. It seems necessary that that a war was to break out because the Nazis are deficit spending in order to pay for this military. And when the war does break out, they are able to conquer other countries, and they're able to use those countries eventually to sustain their war effort, but also to plunder those countries for their gold reserves and things like that. It almost seems like once they've created this giant army, they have to use this giant army or else, go bankrupt. Now, the name of the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, is really kind of a misnomer or really kind of ridiculous, but it is known as National Socialism, and there are socialistic aspects to National Socialism. There are a number of policies to promote children, to help people have children. For example, there are payments to families that have children. There are even medals that are given to women, a bronze Mother's Cross, a silver Mother's Cross, and a gold Mother's Cross for like 4 kids, 6 kids, 8 kids that women are given. There are loans to families if they wanted to, for example, buy a house or build a house. They wanted the creation of as many so-called Aryan people as possible, and so this is socialistic, or at least the socialism is really for people who belong to the folk or belong to the people of the right kind of racial makeup. There's also the so-called KDF, or Kraft durch Freude program, the Strength Through Joy program, that provided low-cost opportunities for all kinds of different entertainment, including for some lucky people, even cruises that they couldn't have afforded before, but just all kinds of rest and relaxation opportunities to keep the Nazi state going and to keep people working for the war effort or the rearmament effort. There's also the idea of a people's car, or a Volkswagen, which was supposed to be a car for every family. And this is not realized. During World War II or before World War II, people started to pay money to Volkswagen, this new business entity, in order to have a car delivered at some point in time. And of course, once the war breaks out, then those cars are turned into Jeeps and used in the war effort. After the war, as you know, the Volkswagen, the Beetle, will actually turn out to be quite a great export hit for the Germans. But same car, more or less, but not realized until after World War II. Here we see some Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy, propaganda posters. You see people on the left. It says, "Even you can travel now." You have a kind of perfect little family. Kind of looks like Little Red Riding Hood and her Aryan husband, with the kids that they've had all crammed into the Volkswagen in order to go out into nature and enjoy that in a very romantic way. And then on the right, you see a guy who is relaxing due to the Strength Through Joy program. Another part of the Nazi plan was to create, and they started to create this as a public works project, the Autobahn, or a system of high-speed highways. And it sounds great, especially if you have a Volkswagen, to be speeding along the Autobahn, but these are not really for German tourists at this point in time. They really are a part of plans for a war, being able to move troops and material by trucks in a kind of high-speed way, in addition to rail. There's a great deal of propaganda in the totalitarian system of Nazi Germany, and there is a minister of propaganda, a guy by the name of Joseph Goebbels. He is the person who controls pretty much all kinds of public entertainments and public media, art, theater, music, film, radio, books, the press. All of these things are turned to transmit propaganda, to repeatedly put into the minds of German people the genius of Hitler, the ideas of Nazism, and brainwash people into Nazi ideology. The thing on the left is a people's radio, the Volksempfänger, which was really quite important for the Nazis. Hitler speaks a lot at certain points in time. Goebbels speaks a lot, and it's a way of getting every single person in Germany to be able to listen to whatever it is that they want to tell the German people. The second poster there with the eagle is a poster for Triumph of the Will, which is a documentary about the 1934 Nuremberg rally, and done by a female director, and it shows really the how unified and organized the Nazis are, and how great they are for Germany, according to the Nazi propaganda. There's a terrible image there. The third image is degenerate music, and you can kind of see how they are playing with racist and anti-Semitic symbology there to criticize jazz music. And then there is a newspaper called Der Stürmer that was a virulently anti-Semitic newspaper that just said all kinds of horrible things about Jewish people. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed the lecture on the Third Reich. It really is a state that starts off with an amazing recovery from the problems of Weimar Germany, from the problems of the left-right struggle of Weimar Germany and the Great Depression and those sorts of things. But it is a totalitarian state which unleashes terror and anti-Semitism, and even the good bits that go along with the Nazi state. You know, the recovery from the Great Depression, the autobahns, all the opportunities for people to have entertainment or relaxation or whatever. All of these things are really just accomplished for a war that Hitler is planning on having, and his ideology of taking over Eastern Europe, and his ideology, quite frankly, of mass murder. Once again, his goal is what they call a 1,000-year Aryan Reich, basically a Nazi state that's going to last forever. And the Nazis were really quite successful, sadly, at creating a totalitarian state where they had total control of their population. Thanks so much for listening and taking notes, and do your reading and do your reading quiz, and that'll be it for today. Thanks.